Welcome and thank you for attending Black History Matters, a series presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basurto, and I am a current senior at Colgate University located in Hamilton, New York, and an intern for the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I will be facilitating the presentation of 28 videos that will be released throughout the month of February 2021 and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. I will now lead you through some introductory statements. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is located in Peterboro, New York, in the building that you can see on the screen, where the inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society was held in 1835. NAHOF's mission is as follows. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. NAHOF has worked in coordination with the Gerrit Smith Estate National Historic Landmark, which is also located in Peterboro, New York, in the creation of the Black History Matters series. The following statement is the purpose of Black History Matters. You can read along on the screen. NAHOF supports racial justice movements seeking to address racial inequality, given their resonance with NAHOF's mission to address the second and ongoing abolition to end racism. NAHOF believes a significant number of Americans do not understand the current racial justice protests due to their unfamiliarity with 4 centuries of Black American history, because this history was either excluded or taught inadequately in schools. NAHOF knows that education is a powerful step towards ending racism, and that understanding the history of the enslavement and dehumanization of Black Americans provides critical context for the ongoing racial justice movements and the persistence of racism in America. Given NAHOF's commitment to strengthening knowledge of history as one route to confront racism, NAHOF will present Black History Matters, a series of crash courses covering some examples of neglected topics in Black American history in February of 2021. I'd like to now invite I will now introduce our presenter, Jacob Mark Donovan Collin. Jake spent his adolescent years in Peterboro, New York, and is passionate about the history of the community. He sits on the Smithfield Community Association and town planning boards. He also volunteers in activities involving the Gerrit Smith Estate and the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I'd like to now introduce our presenter, Jacob Mark Donovan Collin. Jake spent his adolescent years in Peterboro, New York, and is passionate about the history of the community. He sits on the Smithfield Community Association and town planning boards. He also volunteers in activities involving the Gerrit Smith Estate, the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, and the Smithfield Community Center. After graduating from Morrisville High School in 1993, he enlisted into the U.S. Navy and traveled the world. After the Navy, Jake continued his education, earning degrees from Morrisville State College and Cornell University. He is currently working on an MBA degree from Syracuse University, where he also works as an energy plant operations supervisor. We will now begin the presentation in which Jake and I will sit down for an interview in which I will ask him about his experience volunteering with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum, both located in Montgomery, Alabama, and built by the Equal Justice Initiative. So thank you so much for joining me today, Jacob. I guess just to start right off the bat, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your background. You've talked before about how your identity as a mixed race person has informed the way that you saw history, and I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a mixed race. When I was born, I was actually raised by my mother and my father, but my father was my biological father. He was a white Irish man who married my mom before I was born, or actually during I was born. And I grew up in a non-mixed race family, other than myself being a different color, um, and so I think for the longest time, my family and the people that surrounded me and that were around me, my aunts and uncles and everybody else, they were all white. So I think for the longest time, and I also grew up in upstate New York in an area that doesn't see a lot of diversity. I was one of two people in my high school, and that were non-white, and and so I think I grew up kind of naive to a lot of things that other kids maybe in other places with mixed, that black or Asian or any other non-white kids that grew up. I think I grew up kind of shielded from a lot of the racism that other people did growing up.
Yeah, and I know you've spoken before about how you grew up in Peterboro, right?
Yeah,
And so you had some experiences with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum as well as the Gerrit Smith estate. And you've spoken about how even the person of Gerrit Smith has sort of informed your idea about like what white allyship is. And so
right.
could you speak a little bit about can you speak a little bit about the lessons that you sort of took from either Nahop or the Gerrit Smith estate?
Yeah, so I think one of the perspectives that I have growing up is my father, who was my hero, a man by the name of Pat Donovan, was a white man, and he raised me all of his life, and I never felt like I was an other or an outside or anything less than his son. And so he was my hero in the sense that he didn't. I don't believe he saw race. Like he didn't see me as being anything other than his son and caring for me. And the way that shaped my view on people around me is I see a lot of times um, white folk, like I see heroes in people like Gerrit Smith who did things that they didn't have to do, that nobody would have blamed them if they didn't do, but were looking out for people that were less fortunate or people that were being oppressed. And he not only had sympathy for them, but he used his resources to fight for what was right and what was just. And I see that in a lot of people. There, I regard the Freedom Riders who jumped on buses back in the '60s. Um, white folks who jumped on the buses with black folks and rode with them, even though they knew that the buses were going to get pulled over and they were going to get mobbed and possibly killed. And there's something that says there's a huge message in that. Like, how much courage do you have to stand up for somebody that doesn't look like you, that maybe doesn't have a lot in common with you, but you do it anyways, despite the consequences. It's a huge amount of courage, and white allyship, as far as like the whole movement that we're going through now in the United States, with Black Lives Matter and this push to try to reconcile our history and what that means for people. Um, it's extremely important that we have uh, people, white people, who understand our history. They've had the courage to face it, and they have the courage to help make a difference and work for a better world. In this case, I think that says a lot about somebody who can do that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I very much enjoy your perspective on it. I did want to speak a little bit about some of your experiences volunteering with the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, because I know you said that your interest in history was sort of sparked when you volunteered here, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the place as well as for those of us who've never been there, how history is portrayed in this memorial. I know it's a very unique place because the history of lynching is not very prominent in the way that we teach history in American public schools. So could you speak a little bit about both your experience volunteering there as well as your experience sort of learning from the memorial and from the museum?
Sure. So I was sparked to go to the National Memorial of Peace and Justice because of a program that I saw that Oprah Winfrey did. I think it was on 60 Minutes where she actually talked about it. And what actually sparked it was probably several months earlier. I remember seeing a video of ISIS, right, the terrorist network. This was back in 2015, and they had caught a Jordanian pilot and they put him in this cage and they burned him alive. And I remember watching that video and just thinking to myself, what kind of animals could do this? I mean, this was happening right at the time. And I remember you just thinking to myself, this is medieval stuff. Like, what kind of people and animals could do this? And thinking in the context of terrorism and terrorists, right? And then they burn this person alive. And in our day and age, you're able to see that. You're able to see this person be alive and catch on fire and have them, just basically melt. And it was shocking to see, right? And then shortly after, I see this program with Oprah Winfrey. And they show these pictures of lynchings in which African Americans are pulled out of their houses and hung in trees and burned at stakes and stabbed and beaten. And it's in communities in America, like the community that I grew up in. I mean, I can look outside my window and there's pictures of lynchings that look exactly like my town. And all of the people in the town are standing around this African American that's hung in a tree. Sometimes it's mothers, sometimes it's kids. And I remember thinking back to the terrorists and the ISIS and saying, what kind of monsters can do this? And then it hit me. It said, well, we can be monsters too. There's nothing special about America that makes us above being rotten human beings. And we can be monsters too. And so that's what sparked. When I seen that program and it shocked me, I said, I have to go. And I remember the whole thing was the announcement I was talking about, the upcoming memorial being open, the Equal Justice Initiative, the Legacy Museum, and the National Memorial of Peace and Justice. So I immediately just was driven to do anything I could. And so I bought a plane ticket and got on the website and volunteered for as much as I could. And I went down, and it was profound to be involved in that opening. Going to the Legacy Museum and seeing the history, and it's history that we don't get taught. There's a lot of things that I think we brushed over in America because it's uncomfortable to realize. It's uncomfortable to know the truth of what we've done. And it was profound to see the amount of work that people do to kind of bring it back and say, hey, there's no way we can move forward without knowing this history and understanding it. And so my experience definitely was an eye-opener to the fact that we're not immune to being horrible people. None of us are. And I think that we have to be willing to have the courage to see how horrible we can be if we're gonna keep from becoming that horrible.
Yeah, and I like how you talked about sort of the visceralness of, for example, when you see an image of a postcard that was taken at a lynching, there's something about it that's very uncomfortable. And I think sometimes there's a conversation in history about whether or not it's okay to show that pictures of people who were lynched because of that visceralness and because of the reaction that it brings out of people. And sort of in this topic, I do know that in the memorial, instead of creating sort of replicas or something that looks a little bit more human-like, they have these slabs that hang from the roof, and then you can sort of walk through. And as you walk through it, they become higher and higher, and they're meant to represent lynched people, but are not necessarily direct replicas or something that looks very human-like. And I am assuming that you've had the experience of walking through the memorial, and I would like to ask how you feel about that and whether or not you think that maybe a statue that was more similar to a human being would have had more impact, or how you essentially felt about the decision that they made in using that, like in using that sort of abstract form.
Yeah. So the what they are is they're not actually supposed to represent people hanging. What they are is they're monuments that each of them represents a county in the United States where a lynching has occurred. So that's part of it, and the representation of them rising above your head is sort of kind of bring about that idea that, if you're hanging, people that get hanged in a tree, you're kind of looking up at them. So there is sort of that feeling because the way they designed it. But yeah, the monuments themselves are still slabs, and they represent counties. I think there's over 800 at the memorial, over 800 that are hung. And what they do is they write the names of every person that they have documented who was lynched in that county on that memorial slab. So, you can read the names and the date that they were lynched. And so that's kind of like what they used, because between the period of 1877 and 1950, Equal Justice Initiative documented over 4,000, over 4,400 lynchings that took place. So that's kind of why they used the slabs. It wasn't really to represent a single person. It was more to represent, like, these are some counties that had towns, that people came out. And I think what it is it's meant to, if you go down there and you look at a county that is one that's represented here, you might be able to step back and say, these are people that live right around me. We might have went out to the public square and hung somebody because they were Black. And it's not meant to put blame, but I think it's meant to help you realize the truth that this is all around us. And the only way we can ever get past it is to first um, see it. And I think that's what the memorial was trying to do with those.
Yeah, and I do remember reading a little bit about how there are some actual there's a replicas of these slabs so that counties can take them back and actually put them somewhere, I suppose, where they could have it as a monument. And I agree, that's a way of sort of acknowledging that history and recognizing that ordinary people can do these things, that people within your own community in the past were the ones who perpetrated these crimes. And so I think that is another way of commemorating people outside of just a memorial, because you have to actually visit the memorial to see it, versus these would be more in the places where these crimes actually happened.
Right, and that's exactly right. They have replicas of all of these slabs so that any counties that want to reconcile with this um, can ask for a slab, and they can actually create a memorial in their county. It kind of goes to Brian Stevenson is the one who started the Equal Justice Initiative. He's a great man. I did meet him when I was down volunteering. And one of the things he talks about is truth and reconciliation. And as a country, um, his point, which is I think is right on point, is that we're never going to get past this injustice that we did as a country until we can recognize the truth in it and reconcile with it and admit it. And it kind of goes to, I'm sure you're familiar, Victoria, with like the 5 stages of grief, right, that everybody goes through. um, Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. And there's a huge part. The first part is, most people deny, right? Like you see that even today on all kinds of stuff. It's denying the truth. I think, like, there's a huge thing going on right now where it's deny the truth, create your own truth that's more comfortable. And the reason why is because it's hugely uncomfortable for any of us to say, oh my God, like, we're monsters too. We can be monsters too, right? I think that growing up where I did, I'm surrounded, like I said, by the majority of white people that I would call my friends and family. And I believe truly in their hearts that they're good human beings. Um, but it's odd that even like in the town of Smithfield, or where I grew up, it's odd how many people don't come and learn about the history of Gerrit Smith, or that avoid the uncomfortableness of talking about the lynchings and the period of racial injustice in America. And I think a lot of that is just because it's extremely hard and it takes a lot of courage. But the problem is that uh, we need to get to that point if we're ever going to move forward, and we need to allow, it's like the truth and reconciliation, like in South Africa and in some other spots, that you have to allow people to admit their wrongs, and you have to forgive them, or else they remain headstrong in denying what they ever did, and you don't get anywhere. So I think that's part of you know part of this whole truth and reconciliation is also those of us who may are trying to tell the story also being willing to accept when somebody um, gets past that first stage of denial, gets past anger, and finally comes to acceptance on that.
Yeah, and I definitely like how you mentioned that this is something that we see even today. For example, over the summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, there was people who, instead of sort of coming out and acknowledging the history that the United States has with Black Americans, just sort of became more staunch in their beliefs that um, they didn't have anything to do with it. And I think sort of trying to tie the modern day with some of the experiences with the history of lynching. I know that on January 6th, during the Capitol riots, there was this one image that really stuck out to me, which was a noose that had been sort of put up in front of the Capitol. Of course, it was at the time representative of the rioters were chanting "Hang Mike Pence," and so that was sort of a threat to him. But in a way, I think that it was a bit weird to me how this mob basically was reenacting what had happened so many times in the past, using the news as a form of terror. And I was wondering if you saw it, what your first reactions were to it, and how you think this ties into the history of lynching.
Yeah. So yeah, the news, it disappointed me, but it didn't surprise me. One of the things that I really uh, learned from going to the Equal Justice Initiative and listening to Brian Stevenson talk was that lynching wasn't wasn't an individual event, right? So it wasn't about punishment of a person. Lynching was a terror event to terrorize a people, right? You don't drag the patriarch out of his house, um, and hang him in a tree in front of his family and in front of any other Black families to show him that, hey, he did something bad, and now you do that to scare everybody, right? And so it's a terror event. The news, I think, is representative of that type of terrorism.
No, yeah, I agree. It's always surprising to me how it's ordinary people who do sort of one of some of the cruelest things that we see happen. And sort of this was similar in the Capitol. I'm sure not everyone went there with the intention of storming the Capitol, but
Right.
in the moment, just sort of either accepted that or did nothing, despite
Right.
being part of the original like protest. And so, yeah, it definitely speaks to having individual autonomy and how your own individual actions can have a lot of impact, or how your own lack of individual action can also harm people. But if you have any last comments, you can always feel free to share that. But thank you so much for this conversation.
um, this idea of having courage. Um, being mixed race, I I don't have an allegiance to any race. Um, I've always just, I don't have like, I can't say that I'm African American. I can't say that I'm white. I have no allegiance to any race. So I think my perspective in life is one of, there's good people and there's bad people and there's lazy people and there's hard workers. And sometimes we can be any of those, right? Uh, we're all probably any one of those types of people at any given times in our life. But one of the things that I would love to kind of ask for anybody who knows me or anybody who's seeing this and wondering what they could do is, I would say, have the courage to take the first step. Like, have the courage to look at the pictures of lynching. Have the courage to see this history, right? Start there. Just have the courage to go out and see what we have done to ourselves and start there. And don't feel like it's a blame. Just have the courage to do it, and then have the courage, then you can go from there. And I think, there's so many of my friends who've never been to Peterboro and seen the National Abolition Hall of Fame. There's so many of my family who grew up in this town and played in the old buildings that Gerrit Smith owned, but have no idea what Gerrit Smith actually done or did. You know, there are so many of my family members that will avoid seeing this history because it forces you then to reconcile with it, right? And be able to look in the mirror and say, I did this. Not me personally, but we did this. And that takes courage and it takes strength. And, anybody, including myself, like, when you have that courage to stand up and kind of see it and then look in the mirror, then you can start down that path of truth and reconciliation, and you can really free yourself. I think Brian Stevenson said that that's how you really become free. And as a nation, we're not going to be free, black or white, until we get through this smog of our history and face it and reconcile with it and then move beyond it.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I love the quote behind you because it definitely speaks to that.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Jake for joining me in this very informative conversation. If you're interested in learning more about the museum and the memorial, I have provided some sources in the video description, basically some website links that you can follow to learn a little bit more about the places as well as how to visit them. I will also invite you to fill out a quick survey that is also in that same video description, which will help us gather feedback about the specific topic and presentation. This survey will take you no more than 5 minutes to fill out and will provide us with valuable information that will help us in the formation of future presentations like this one. Should you have any questions regarding the presentation or the interview itself, Jake has made his email available so that you may contact him with any questions or comments that you may have. Additionally, please do contact NAHOF with any questions or if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. NAHOF's contact information is on the screen. Once again, I'd like to thank Jake for joining me in this conversation. I really enjoyed learning a lot about the monument and the museum. And I would like to thank him so much for helping us provide a program for the Black History Matters series. I'd like to also thank you, the audience, for joining us in this conversation. Please remember that we will be releasing a video every single day of this February, and we hope to see you at our next presentations. Thank you.